In October 2015, Sarah Miller opened her eyes after 5 long years of darkness. Her body felt weak, as though awakening from a deep, endless sleep, while her mind was engulfed in chaos. The doctors couldn't hide their astonishment. Her chances of survival following the car accident had been deemed minimal. 5 years in a coma, and the prognosis had been grim. Yet now Sarah had returned to life, and to the world, it seemed nothing short of a miracle. But for Sarah herself, this new reality felt unfamiliar and cold. Her husband, James Miller, was the first person she saw upon waking. He smiled, but the smile was as cold as a winter wind. "I'm so glad you're back," he said, holding her fragile hand. But the joy Sarah remembered in his eyes was absent. Maybe it's just the shock, she thought, trying to make sense of his demeanor. A few days after her discharge from the hospital, James brought Sarah home. But the house that had once been her warm sanctuary now seemed alien. The rooms where she had lived and made memories appeared somehow different. The kitchen had been renovated. Nothing stood where she remembered it. In the living room, her photographs had been taken down from the walls, and their family albums were nowhere to be found. When Sarah asked James about it, he merely shrugged. "I thought you wouldn't want to see them after everything," he said. What disturbed Sarah even more was that the room on the second floor, where she had kept her personal belongings, books, journals, and souvenirs, had been transformed into James's office. The shelves, once lined with her favorite novels, were now meticulously arranged with files, papers, and a sleek computer. An uneasy feeling began to stir inside her, but she couldn't quite pinpoint why. When she inquired about Jessica Hart, the housekeeper who had looked after their home during her coma, James answered too quickly, as if eager to avoid the subject. "She left the job suddenly, probably found something better." Sarah remembered Jessica as a cheerful young woman, always smiling and ready to help. Something about James's response didn't sit right with her, but she didn't want to leap to conclusions. Returning to life was far from easy. Her body betrayed her. Her hands trembled. Her legs felt alien, and every step was a struggle. She spent hours sitting by the window, staring out at a world that was familiar yet distant. Alice Harris, her neighbor and once a close friend, came by to welcome her back, but their conversation was strained. "It's good to have you home," Alice said, "but a lot has changed." Those words unsettled Sarah. What had changed? She tried to ask, but Alice grew visibly uneasy and quickly changed the subject. Behind the polite words and strained smiles, Sarah felt something was being left unsaid. Every night her dreams were clouded with fragmented memories from her coma, disjointed and cryptic. James's voice, someone laughing, the touch of hands that didn't belong to him. She woke up drenched in sweat, her heart racing, only to find that reality felt even more confusing. When Sarah asked James about their life during her absence, his answers were brief. "It was hard, but we managed," he said, his words more dutiful than loving. She remembered how they used to laugh together, how they'd spend evenings cooking dinner or watching movies. But now, this James seemed like a stranger with indifferent eyes. As the days passed, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that the world around her was hiding something important. She decided to pay closer attention to the details that might have once gone unnoticed. Her mind, though still fragile, began to sharpen, even as her body remained frail. Every new detail she noticed seemed like a piece of a larger puzzle. But what was this puzzle? And why did it feel as though she were a stranger in her own home? The first few weeks after returning home were grueling and filled with unease for Sarah Miller. Her body, weakened by 5 years in a coma, was slowly recovering, but her psyche struggled to keep up. She spent her days in silence, wandering through the rooms that had once been familiar, but now felt foreign. James tried to be attentive, but his detachment grew more apparent with each passing day. He often stayed late at work, and when he came home, he looked exhausted and irritable. One evening, while James was out meeting a client, Sarah finally mustered the courage to open one of the drawers in the living room, a drawer that used to be filled with small family trinkets. Inside, instead of the usual keys, notebooks, or loose papers, she found an object that made her heart stop for a moment. It was a silver bracelet, elegant, with delicate engravings. Sarah was certain she had never seen it before. "Whose bracelet is this?" she thought, but no answer came to mind. Instead of placing it back, she tucked it into her pocket, realizing that she needed to know more. That night she couldn't sleep. her mind racing with questions about where the bracelet had come from. The next morning, her suspicions only deepened. As James got ready for work, Sarah sat on the edge of the bed, watching him as she often did. She noticed a faint scent of perfume on his shirt, a fragrance she had never encountered before, distinctly feminine and unfamiliar. When she asked, "What's that smell?" James waved it off with a quick, "Probably from one of my coworkers at the office, nothing unusual." But his dismissive tone sounded like an attempt to hide something. Sarah began paying closer attention to every little detail. Her sense of unease grew as she reflected on how much James had changed. He avoided conversations about their past. When Sarah tried to reminisce about moments from before the accident, he would simply say, "That's all in the past, Sarah. We need to look forward." One day, Alice Harris, her neighbor, came over for tea. Sitting in the kitchen, they talked about ordinary topics, weather, neighbors, and home renovations. But Sarah sensed that Alice knew more than she was letting on. During the conversation, Alice let something slip. "I saw James with Jessica a few times. They seemed close." Realizing she had said too much, Alice quickly fell silent. Sarah was shaken. She remembered that the housekeeper who had cared for the home during her coma had suddenly disappeared, a fact that now seemed suspicious. That night, Sarah felt she wouldn't be able to sleep. An idea came to her. If James was hiding something, his office might hold the answers. She waited until he was asleep, then tiptoed downstairs. In his office, her attention was drawn to one of the upper shelves. There was a small box locked shut. Sarah didn't know how to open it until she noticed a key and a cup holding pens and pencils. Unlocking the box, she found something that left no room for doubt. Photographs of Jessica taken inside their house, dated after the accident. Alongside the photographs were receipts for expensive gifts addressed to Jessica. One of the receipts was dated just a month ago. The next morning, as James got ready to leave for work, Sarah could only nod silently in response to his goodbye. Her heart felt heavy, her mind racing as she tried to piece together the fragments of the puzzle. Now she knew for certain, James was lying to her. But what else was he hiding? Though still physically weak after her years in a coma, Sarah Miller summoned all her mighty power to continue seeking the truth. The gnawing suspicion that James was hiding something had become impossible to ignore. The photographs of Jessica in her home, the receipts for extravagant gifts, these were just the beginning. That quiet voice in her mind, once faint and hesitant, now screamed, "Act." As usual, James left for work in the morning. Alone in the house, Sarah resolved to return to his office, which now felt like a vault of hidden answers. On the desk sat James's laptop. She hesitated for only a moment, knowing she couldn't waste any time. But how would she gain access? She remembered that James used the same password for nearly everything in the past. After a few attempts, she succeeded in unlocking it. Her heart pounded as she opened his email. At first, the inbox contained the expected work correspondence, meeting requests. But as she scrolled further, she spotted a familiar name. Jessica Hart. Her hands froze over the keyboard as her breath caught in her throat. She opened the first email. Dated 2 weeks prior, the email read, "I miss our evenings together. Do you really think you can keep living with her as if nothing happened? We need to decide when this will all end." The words hit Sarah like a punch to the stomach, but she forced herself to keep reading. The next email was filled with talk of shared plans and the best way to use the money. At first, Sarah didn't understand what this meant, but as she scrolled down, she stumbled upon a draft of a document. It was James's will. Her name had been crossed out, replaced by Jessica's. Sarah stared at the screen in disbelief. She reread the document several times to make sure she wasn't mistaken. James had been planning to erase her completely, not just from his life, but from his legacy. Her hands began to shake. She shut the laptop, but not before saving copies of the emails and the draft will to a flash drive she found in the desk drawer. That day changed everything. As Sarah reflected on her time in the coma, fragmented memories began to resurface. Voices, touches, whispers. She had always dismissed these as figments of her imagination. But now, after uncovering the emails and the evidence, she realized they might have been real. James and Jessica had been together in her home, in her life while she lay powerless in a hospital bed. When James came home that evening, Sarah didn't say a word. Her face was calm, but inside her emotions churned violently. She studied his every move, every word, every glance. His smile felt forced, his words hollow. "How was your day, darling?" he asked, as if everything were normal. "Fine," she replied, keeping her voice steady. James didn't notice any change in her demeanor, which only reinforced Sarah's growing certainty. He believed his lies were safe. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. Her thoughts swirled around everything she had discovered. She pieced together all the signs she had ignored before: the absence of her belongings in the house, Alice's strange remarks, the bracelet, the unfamiliar perfume. It all painted a picture of betrayal that had begun long before she woke up. At 3 in the morning, with the house shrouded in silence, Sarah sat in the living room, clutching the flash drive in her hand. Her heart was torn between wanting to know more and fearing what else might come to light. But now she knew one thing for certain: James had betrayed her. And this was only the tip of the iceberg. The next morning, Sarah decided she would no longer be a passive observer in her own life. She could not sit idly by anymore. She needed answers, and she would do whatever it took to uncover the full truth. November 15th, 2015 began like any other autumn morning in Sandville. The sky was weighed down by heavy clouds, and the damp wind carried the smell of decaying leaves. But for neighbor Alice Harris, this day would remain unforgettable. Around 8 in the morning, she heard a loud crash coming from the Miller's house. The noise was so jarring that she dropped her teacup and rushed to the window. Her hands trembled as she dialed the police. Within minutes, officers Adam Johnson and Bethany Carter arrived on the scene. They had been alerted about a possible domestic disturbance, so they approached the house cautiously. The front door was wide open, and an eerie silence filled the air. Inside, the sight that greeted them left them stunned. They quickly realized that something catastrophic had occurred. The officers conducted a brief search and found Sarah in the kitchen. She was sitting calmly at the table, staring out the window. When Bethany Carter asked gently, "Sarah, what happened?" Sarah replied coldly, "He deserved it." Her words shocked the officers, but they followed protocol. Adam placed Sarah in handcuffs while Bethany remained behind to examine the scene. Sarah offered no resistance. She was completely composed, as if she had already accepted what was happening. The initial picture painted by the police was one of chaos. Signs of a violent struggle were evident in the home, especially in the living room where James Miller's body was found. What struck the officers most, however, was Sarah's demeanor. She did not cry, scream, or attempt to explain herself. Her responses to their questions were curt and emotionless. "What made you do this?" Adam Johnson asked as they drove her to the station. Sarah replied quietly, "You'll understand soon enough." Meanwhile, the Miller's house quickly became a hub of activity for investigators and forensics teams. They took photographs of the scene, collected evidence, and combed through James's office for anything that might shed light on the events leading up to his death. It wasn't long before they stumbled upon the same box Sarah had opened weeks earlier. Inside were the photographs of Jessica, the receipts for expensive gifts, and the draft will that excluded Sarah from James's estate. These items painted a damning picture of betrayal and deceit. The story quickly spread throughout Sandville, igniting a firestorm of gossip and speculation. Journalists dubbed it the Ghost Woman case, referring to Sarah's seemingly miraculous return to life after years in a coma, only to find herself at the center of a horrifying crime. Everyone in town had an opinion, and while some sympathized with Sarah, others branded her as cold-blooded. Alice Harris, the neighbor who had witnessed the aftermath, shared conflicting emotions in a local news interview. "Sarah was always such a kind woman," she said, "but after she came back, something about her was different. It was like she was a shadow of her former self." When Sarah was questioned at the police station, she offered little insight into her actions. When asked what had happened that morning, she replied simply, "I did what I had to do." Her calmness only deepened the investigators' sense of unease. By the end of the day, James Miller's body was sent for autopsy, and the house was sealed off. Sarah was placed in a holding cell, but it was clear that the story was far from over. What initially seemed like a straightforward case of domestic violence was beginning to look much more complex and tangled. As the investigation continued, the town of Sandville buzzed with theories and speculation. But one thing was certain: this was only the beginning of a much larger and darker tale. The Sandville police launched a thorough investigation into the murder of James Miller. At first glance, the case seems straightforward, a wife killing her husband in a fit of rage. But with every new piece of evidence, the situation grew more complex, and the motives deeper. Sarah Miller was taken into custody immediately. During interrogations, she remained composed, avoiding unnecessary emotion. Her answers to the detective's questions were brief, and sometimes she didn't answer at all. She neither denied her involvement nor provided any details. Her behavior intrigued the investigators. People in her position typically either broke under pressure or tried to justify their actions. Sarah did neither. The search of the Millers' home revealed disturbing details. In James's office, forensic investigators found the box Sarah had already discovered weeks earlier. Inside were photographs of Jessica Hart, receipts for expensive gifts, and the draft of James's will that excluded Sarah as a beneficiary. These items became key pieces of evidence in the investigation. They confirmed that James had been in a long-term relationship with Jessica, a relationship that began well before Sarah had awakened from her coma. Further examination of James's laptop uncovered a series of incriminating emails. Investigators speculated that the money mentioned in the emails referred to a large sum James had withdrawn from a shared bank account shortly before his death, money that had not yet been accounted for. Jessica Hart, now living in another city, was brought in for questioning. She agreed to cooperate, claiming she wanted to clear her name. During her interview, Jessica denied knowing anything about James's plans to rewrite his will or exclude Sarah. She described her relationship with James as strictly personal, unrelated to his wife or his marriage. However, neighbor Alice Harris provided a different perspective. She confirmed that she had seen Jessica at the Millers' home multiple times, even after Sarah had returned from the hospital. Alice also mentioned overhearing heated arguments between James and Jessica. Her testimony painted a picture of a complicated relationship where Sarah had been relegated to an afterthought, if not an outright obstacle. Doctors who examined her after her arrest pointed to her fragile psychological state. They cited the 5 years she had spent in a coma as a traumatic experience that likely left lasting emotional and mental scars. They suggested that Sarah's actions might have been driven by overwhelming stress rather than a calculated plan. At the same time, the financial evidence raised new suspicions. In addition to the missing money, investigators found inconsistencies in James's financial records. Checks and transactions linked to Jessica suggested that their relationship may not have been purely personal, as Jessica had claimed. The investigation also uncovered unsettling details about James's behavior before Sarah's accident. Witnesses and former acquaintances described him as controlling, and some hinted at patterns of emotional manipulation within the marriage. This revelation complicated the public's perception of James as the victim. The town of Sandville became divided, with residents taking sides. Some viewed Sarah as a victim of her circumstances, a woman who had been abandoned, deceived, and ultimately pushed too far. Jessica Hart's sudden departure from Sandville after her questioning only added fuel to the fire. Though she claimed innocence, her evasive behavior and her name's presence in the evidence left many wondering. Was she more involved than she let on? And if so, to what extent? As prosecutors prepared their case against Sarah, the police continued to uncover layers of betrayal, lies, and pain. For Sarah, who sat in her holding cell, the weight of the truth was both her burden and her weapon. She knew that the betrayal she had uncovered was only a fraction of the story, but she also understood one thing. The world now saw her as either a victim or a villain. The truth, however, was far more complicated. The trial of Sarah Miller began in December 2015, drawing intense public interest from the outset. The courtroom was packed. Journalists, locals, and even visitors from neighboring towns came to witness the proceedings. From the very first session, it became clear that this trial would spark significant debate. The lead prosecutor, a stern man with a commanding voice, emphasized Sarah's access to James's office and laptop. He argued that she had unearthed evidence of the affair, uncovered the will, and then acted with full awareness of her actions. Mrs. Miller had complete control over her decisions that morning, he declared, presenting photographs from the crime scene that showed signs of a struggle and the weapon, a heavy candlestick. The trial became a battlefield of opposing narratives. Witnesses took the stand, some defending Sarah, while others sided with the prosecution. Alice Harris, Sarah's neighbor, was one of the key witnesses. She confirmed seeing Jessica at the Miller house several times, even after Sarah had returned from the hospital. Alice also testified to overhearing heated arguments between James and Jessica, which suggested tension in their relationship. Alice's testimony added depth to the narrative of betrayal, implying that James had been emotionally distant from Sarah long before the crime. Jessica Hart, however, refused to testify in court. Her emails with James, which had been entered into evidence, spoke volumes. The correspondence revealed a deep personal relationship between Jessica and James, plans for their future together, and their financial dealings. The emails even included disparaging remarks about Sarah. Expert witnesses verified the authenticity of these emails, which became a cornerstone of the defense's argument that Sarah had been pushed to a breaking point. Sarah herself testified only once during the trial. She spoke calmly without tears or theatrics. The trial reached its climax as the closing arguments were delivered. The prosecution reiterated their stance that Sarah acted with intent and premeditation. The defense, meanwhile, implored the jury to consider Sarah's psychological state, the betrayal she had endured, and the emotional and mental scars she bore after years of isolation. The jury deliberated for hours, leaving the courtroom buzzing with tension. Reporters speculated wildly about the outcome. The case had captured the nation's attention, not only because of its sensational details, but also because it raised deeper questions. How far can betrayal push a person? At what point does a victim become an offender? When the jury finally returned, the entire courtroom held its breath. Everyone, Sarah, the lawyers, the spectators, knew that the verdict would be as polarizing as the case itself. For Sarah, this moment would decide not only her future, but also how the world would remember her, as a victim of circumstances or as the architect of her husband's death. On December 26, 2015, the moment of truth arrived in Sarah Miller's trial. The courtroom was packed to capacity. Journalists with cameras, attorneys, family members, and residents of Sandville, all waiting anxiously. The small town seemed to hold its breath. The jury filed back into the room after hours of deliberation, their expressions grave and unreadable. No one could guess the outcome. The judge called the court to order, and silence fell over the room. You could hear the faint rustle of paper in the clerk's hands. Sarah sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap. Outwardly, she appeared calm, but her eyes betrayed the weight of everything she had endured. This was the moment that would determine the rest of her life. The foreman of the jury stood and addressed the judge. Opted the jury find the defendant, Sarah Miller, guilty of involuntary manslaughter. The words echoed through the courtroom like a thunderclap. Gasps and murmurs erupted from the audience, a mix of relief, shock, and disbelief. Some people jumped out of their seats, trying to process what they had just heard. The judge banged the gavel, calling for silence. The judge rose and delivered the sentence. Sarah Miller is hereby sentenced to 10 years in prison, with eligibility for parole after 5 years. Given the unique circumstances of this case, this court believes the sentence to be just. His voice was firm yet measured, as if he too was aware of the complexity of the situation. The courtroom erupted again, this time with louder reactions. Some viewed the sentence as too lenient. Others felt the sentence was too harsh, arguing that Sarah had already suffered immeasurably and was pushed to her breaking point by years of betrayal and neglect. As Sarah was escorted out of the courtroom, her eyes briefly met Alice Harris's, who was seated in the back row. Alice gave her a sorrowful shake of the head, her expression heavy with regret. She, perhaps more than anyone else, understood that there were no winners in this story. Jessica Hart was notably absent from the courtroom during the sentencing. After her testimony and brief questioning by police, she had disappeared from Sandville entirely. Rumors suggested that she had moved to another city or even another country, changing her name to escape the scandal. To many, her absence symbolized unfinished justice. Her role in James's betrayal and the unraveling of Sarah's life remained a contentious topic, one that the legal system never fully addressed. The public remained divided, with heated debates dominating television programs, social media, and town gatherings. Everyone seemed to have an opinion, but one thing was clear. This was a story that would linger in people's minds for years to come. For Sarah, a new chapter of her life began behind bars. The first weeks in prison were incredibly difficult. Her body was still weak from the long years of immobility, and her mind struggled to process everything she had experienced. Sarah's journal became a way for her to make sense of the chaos. Over time, her fellow inmates began to notice her quiet resilience. Initially, they treated her with suspicion, but as Sarah opened up about her struggles, though never revealing all the details of her case, she began to earn their respect. She spoke of survival, of finding strength even when it seemed impossible, and her words resonated with many of the women around her. When Sarah was granted parole in 2020, she left prison quietly, without fanfare or media attention. She moved to a small coastal town where no one knew her story. There she found work at a local library and began volunteering to help women who had experienced trauma and betrayal. Her journal was eventually published as a memoir, becoming an unexpected bestseller. Though the past would always be a part of her, Sarah learned to live with it. She understood one crucial truth. Life is not only about what happens to you, but about what you choose to do with it afterward. The story of Sarah Miller left an indelible mark on the small town of Sandville and far beyond its borders. It became the subject of whispered conversations in cafes, front-page articles in newspapers, and heated debates on television. But no matter which side people took, they all understood one thing. This was more than a story about a crime. It was a story about betrayal, pain, and the devastating consequences for everyone involved. But while Sarah's story found new life in the public eye, Jessica Hart remained a mystery. After testifying and briefly cooperating with authorities, she disappeared from Sandville. Rumors swirled that she had changed her name and moved to another country. Her disappearance frustrated many who believed she had played a much larger role in the tragedy than was ever revealed. To some, her vanishing act symbolized a grave injustice, proof that not all those responsible had been held accountable. Back in Sandville, the Miller house became a somber landmark. It remained empty for 2 years, its windows dark and its walls silent. For the townspeople, it was a constant reminder of the tragedy and betrayal that had unfolded there. Eventually, the property was sold, and the new owners remodeled it entirely, hoping to erase its painful history. But for those who knew the story, the house would always carry a shadow of its past. Her journals were eventually published as a memoir, which became an unexpected bestseller. Readers from all over the country were captivated by her candid reflections and raw honesty. The book wasn't just a retelling of her tragic story, it was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. In its pages, Sarah wrote, "Away, Mom. I once thought my life had ended, that I had nothing left. But I've learned that life is what you make of it after the storms have passed. Pain can destroy you, or it can shape you into something new." Though she lived quietly, far from the public eye, Sarah's name continued to spark debates. Was she a victim, a survivor, or a criminal? The world remained divided, but Sarah no longer cared about how she was perceived. She had found peace in her small town, surrounded by books, the sea, and a sense of purpose. As time passed, the town of Sandville moved on. New scandals and stories replaced Sarah's in the headlines. But for those who had lived through the events, the memory of what had happened in the Miller house never faded completely. It was a story of betrayal, love, and the fragile line between justice and vengeance. For Sarah, life after prison was no longer about what had been lost, but about what could still be built. She understood that while the scars of her past would always remain, they didn't have to define her. Her story became one of survival, not just of the body, but of the soul. And in the quiet moments of her new life, she found what she had been searching for all along, herself.